Hey, welcome back to Rebel Movement Podcast. My name is Billie. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her, and I'm happy you're here. I am really excited for this episode. I've actually already recorded it, but last week there was some technical difficulties, and I lost the recording. And I also, right at the beginning here, want to say that if you tried to listen to last week's episode on the Thursday that it came out, so I don't know what day that would be, like Thursday, March, I don't know, end of March. And the audio was weird. Try to listen to it again if you didn't get all the way through it, because I fixed it. There was a couple of technical difficulties, one of which was that episode audio that was totally fine on everything else I listened to it. And then when I put it onto Spotify or put it into all the podcast platforms, it messed up and it didn't sound good. So now it's fixed. I also should, hopefully, if this other technical thing I'm trying out works, should have a transcript for this episode, which if you should be able to check out in the show notes. I think we will learn about that together because I'm not sure. And what else is there? Oh, there's more platforms you can listen to this podcast now on Castbox, on Amazon podcasts, on a couple of other platforms anyway. You should, if you go to my link tree and click the button about, Radio Public is the other one. If you click the button about my podcast and it takes you to the Spotify for podcasters page, you'll see a little underneath the podcast photo. There's a bunch of little icons for different places you can listen to it. So if you're not sure of where to listen to this, there's lots of options there. iHeartRadio is one. There's some free options to listen to it, or just right there in the Spotify for podcasters thing. They are updating their things. Hopefully that link will still be called the same thing. They're just updating how we log in as Spotify or as podcasters. So anyway, boring stuff out of the way. I don't really have any personal updates for you today, other than I guess I should say, if you want to work with me, check out the link in the show notes. You can work with me one-on-one. You can work with me to do like anti-diet life coaching. So figuring out how to heal and recover from a lifetime of dieting and diet culture and eating disorder stuff, and how to start moving your body again. If you want to do online group classes or grab on demand, you can go there. And also, if you are a teacher, yoga teacher, movement teacher, life coach, whatever, and you want to start working with me to figure out how you can be more inclusive, how you can teach more queer safe, trauma informed classes. If you want to do any of this work with me, you can also click the link in the show notes and we can set up a free 30-minute consult. Okay. All that aside, what I want to talk about today is props, because props often get a really bad rap. Like, depending on where you're at in the whole thing with diet culture, maybe you're at a point now where you're like, oh my God, I love props. They're great. In which case I'm so happy to hear it. But also, you probably remember a time in your yoga journey where props were kind of seen as this, or yoga or movement journey, props were kind of seen as like a weakness. And I disagree with that, but when I first started, I did have that impression as well. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about ways that you can use props. I'll do a little recap at the end. Shouldn't be a super long episode. But I also am going to give options for if you practice at home and you don't have the money for props. I'm going to give you some options for things you can do, things you can use around your house for props, or for either yoga or fitness, like weightlifting style classes. So you can either fast forward to that, or stick around till the end to figure those tips out as well, or hear those tips as well. So honestly, I don't know. I haven't done tons and tons of studies into why props started to be villainized. I don't know the entire history. I'm going to take a wild guess to say diet culture was involved, though. Because I wish you could answer, because I wish this could be interactive. Because I'm really interested to know what, when you first started using props or now, what are your impressions of when you use them or why you use them? Because I think that a lot of the time we may think that you use them, um, if you're not, quote, flexible enough, or if you're not, quote, strong enough. So we might get the impression that using them is like a weakness. Because have you ever been in a class and heard the teacher say, "Oh, if you can't, let's see, if you can't reach the floor, just use a block. If you can't, oh, if you're, I'm trying to think of examples of where I've seen this, but it's been so long since I've been exposed to this kind of thing. It's hard to have specific examples. Um, well, hopefully the impression is sort of made though. Like it's often been bad things. I guess maybe we don't have to spend the whole episode talking about this because you probably already know your impression of props and maybe impressions that you've got previously. So I want to talk about a couple of ways that you can use them. And there's so many, but these are just a couple of like the more, I don't want to say more common ways or my favorite ways. One of them is if you have some shorter limbs. I personally have a long torso, short arms, and short legs, which means that if I'm sitting on the floor and say we're going to do a twist, so if you're sitting on the floor, cross legged, whatever, and then you're twisting towards the right and someone cues you to put your hand on the floor behind you. If I were to put my whole hand on the floor behind me, I either end up shifting back, so I'm kind of leaning back or rounding my spine, or I have to be propped up on my tops of my fingers, which is sometimes fine, but is not always the most comfortable. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't feel that great all the time. Sometimes it's totally fine. Other times it's not. So in that circumstance, I often, when I'm doing a twist on like sitting on the ground like that, I will use a block underneath my hand so that I can kind of extend my limbs. So it's like you can kind of extend your limbs with them. Another example of that would be if you are, so if you're laying on your back, and I think most often I instruct this with a strap, but if you're laying on your back, you put your foot, say your right foot up towards the ceiling. Doesn't have to be reaching the ceiling, but you know what I mean. Or you're not reaching the ceiling unless you have really long legs and short ceilings. But I mean, it doesn't have to be straight up. It can be less of an angle than 90 degrees. Um, some people might hold the back of their leg for that. Like you might have your interlace your fingers behind your right thigh kind of thing. And then you might use a strap, step your foot to the middle of the strap, hold the sides of the strap so that in a sense you're lengthening you're adding length to your arms to hold your leg in a different way. You might do that in um, wind relieving where you're hugging your knee in towards your chest. Sometimes I find with certain like textures of pants, wind relieving, if you're laying on your back, your knees hugged into your chest. That's basically the whole thing. You just hug your knee into your chest. Certain textures of pants I find really slippery, and or if you're in something like hot yoga or whatever, it's sometimes really I find it really annoying if I'm trying to do that pose and my hands keep slipping. So use a strap, and then it's like fixes that problem. So the first kind of simplified method of using over why you might use props is extending your limbs. um, you can also use there's so many different types of props. I actually don't know the name of this one where it's like a little wedge, like a tiny little triangle. If you're in a tabletop or a plank position, sometimes that can be a lot on your wrist. So having that little tiny wedge so that it kind of lifts the heel of your hand up can help to relieve some feelings in your wrist. Or you might do a similar thing if you're kneeling, like sitting on your shins. You might put a little bit of a wedge or um, pillowing type of thing underneath the fronts of your ankles. So I guess that kind of transitions us into the second thing. The thing that I think is really important to understand in any of this work, whether you're a student or a teacher, is that every single person's body is different. And every single body's history is different. Every single joint's history is different. You and their mobility. So if you don't know about mobility, range of motion, that kind of thing, listen to the episode about flexibility. Does yoga make you more flexible? It's not that long ago, so you shouldn't have to scroll down too far. But keeping in mind that every person's flexibility, mobility, histories are different, it's not going to work if we're trying to just make our posture or make our body fit the posture. That's the impression I think a lot of us get, and why maybe in the past we've seen using props as like a weakness, because we've gotten the impression that our body has to fit a very specific shape, and that if you're using the props, it means you've done something wrong or your body isn't right. That's not true at all. Every body is never going to be the exact same. Every body is never going to have the same mobility, same shape, same anything ever. And I think it can be harmful, and it's taking a lot out of the practice if we're teaching, or if we're teaching in a way that is giving that impression. So, with that in mind, props are a really fantastic tool to help change the shape or change the shape of the posture to fit your body. For example, pigeon pose. That one, you're bringing your knee up behind your ankle. So if you're in tabletop or down dog, you're going to bring your knee, say right knee, up behind your right wrist. I meant to say wrist, not ankle. Back leg is long. You might be up on your hands, or you might be laying down. So your front knee is on the ground. It's out on a bit of an angle. Your right foot's kind of close to your left hip crease-ish. Different per person. For some folks, you can come into that posture and be totally supported, and you have no back pain, no knee pain, no hip pain, all good. Maybe your right hip is supported, and you can just lay down, no problem. Some folks will, if they try to lay down, will feel a little bit like they're being squished, or your right hip might be really lifted, and then it just doesn't feel maybe good on your knee. Maybe your knee feels weird. Maybe your low back feels weird. Maybe everything feels weird. Maybe it's so intense. Maybe the stretch is like a 10 out of 10. And I'm not saying you're going to love pigeon if you change your approach. You might not love it still. But if you use a pillow or bolster underneath your right hip, or maybe even underneath your right hip and the front of your left hip crease, it's like you can bring the floor to meet you rather than you having to meet the floor. So that will ease off some of the pressure on your joints, which will probably make it more comfortable. If you put a pillow or bolster or blocks underneath your chest, or belly or head, depends on the person, that will move your body a little further from the floor, which will probably help you feel less squished. These are just two ways of using it. And if you're interested in, learning more about these, you can always work with me one-on-one. We can go into all the options for every single posture if you want to, but it's just a way of changing the shape of the posture to fit your body, or changing the environment around you to support you better. Because there's nothing wrong with your body that your right hip is lifted in pigeon. Period. That's like the end of that thought, right? There is nothing wrong with your body if it's not meeting the exact standards or the exact shape of that posture. I shouldn't say standard. It's more so the standards we put on it, or some teachers put on it, or diet culture puts on it, or this whole long history. What might be happening is maybe you don't have that range of motion in your right hip yet. Maybe you have some tight muscles that are preventing it. Maybe you will never have the range of motion in your hip because of the way that your hip is actually put together. Maybe you've had hip replacement. Maybe you have arthritis. Maybe you have an upset stomach. So it doesn't feel good to have your stomach pressed into your legs. There's Many, 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 many reasons. Maybe your left hip front of your left hip is tight. There's so many reasons this might not work for you. Um, and rather than having to feel so much shame and pressure to fit into the posture, I promise you it's so much better of an experience if you use the props to help support your body so that you can actually enjoy the posture. Because if you go into pigeon and it's a 10 out of 10 intensity, it's like super, super, super intense, you're just probably going to hold your breath or tense your whole body up to make it through the posture until finally the teacher tells you you can leave, and then your body will actually be more tense. You probably are not that relaxed, maybe a little bit annoyed, and it's just kind of like defeating the purpose of some of the practice, right? Like not the whole practice is not just like a waste, but it's um it's a different experience. So, our first thing is we can use props to help extend our limbs. Our second thing is to help change the shape of the posture to meet our bodies. Number 3, I think, is it number 3 we're on now? Is to provide us feedback to bring more awareness to our bodies. This one I really like. I love all of them, but I really like for this kind of thing because it's so cool. So I've just wrote a newsletter about this and I published it as a blog on my website. So you should be able to go to it's under the about section of my website under blog. Um, I think it's called "What does it mean to listen? How do I know if what I need or what does it mean to listen to your body?" Something like that. And I talk about if you don't know what's going on in your body, if someone says listen to your body and you have no idea what that means, go read that and then come back. Um, so like spark notes is for a lot of reasons a lot of us don't have a lot of awareness of our bodies, whether it's trauma, whether it's the fact that we live in a capitalist culture that has us going from morning till night. We have no time or space or whatever the simple reasons. um, some of us don't know what's going on in our body, and not all of us have done training in anatomy or yoga teacher training and know what is actually supposed to be happening in shapes or postures, which is fine. You don't need to know that stuff. That's why the teachers are there. Um, so let's use an example from a workout class that you might also see this posture in a yoga class. So let's use a squat, for example. You might see this in a yoga class in powerful pose. Lightning bolt is sometimes called. And I'm not going to say the Sanskrit name because I'm second guessing myself on what the Sanskrit word is. Um, so in a squat, ideally, knees are pointing in the same direction as toes. And I'm just going to say right here, this isn't what the podcast is about, but your knees can pass your toes. That's fine, totally normal range of motion thing to do. I've said this before. I'm going to say it 5 million more times. Your knees can pass your toes. So let's say we're doing squats, and I personally tend to favor the muscles on the outside of my legs than more than the inside, which might mean if I'm doing a squat and I'm not aware of this, it might mean my knees are going to point out more than my toes. Um, and which means I'm like, when you get down to but you're not going to go down to the foundation of it, but when you get down to part of it, like the details of it, I'm using the muscles on the outside of my leg more than the inside of my leg. In this scenario, if I were to place a block right above my knees and focus on kind of squeezing the block so that I don't drop it, that's going to engage the muscles on the inside of my legs, which will ideally bring my knees back over top of my toes or balance out the posture a little bit. Vice versa, if you are a person who favors the inside of your legs, and when you're doing this posture, I mean, like your body, like when you by default use the inside muscles on the inside of your leg more than the outside, your knees might be in more than your toes, which you don't have to necessarily use props for. You can just kind of bring awareness and think about pressing out a little bit. But if you were to use a resistance band, you can put that above your knees as well, and you have to kind of intentionally press into it. That will help. Or Use a block between your outside of your leg and the wall, or your hands on the outside of your knees, press back out into them. That will help bring more awareness to those muscles so that you're balancing out. Bringing more awareness to your posture as well. So you don't necessarily need to know, oh, I favor the outside muscle, like muscles on the outside when I squat. You don't need to know that. But you might just use the props to experiment. Next time you go into powerful pose, grab a block and put it right above your knees. Notice what happens. If you feel like, oh, you're going to drop the block, like you just drop the block immediately, you're like, okay, cool. Maybe you notice, oh, I'm a little bit more aware of the muscles on the inside of my leg. Cool. That's just one way. There's many other places you can use it. Some people will use a block between their upper arms if they're coming into something like a pigeon pose, or they'll use like a resistance band. Some people will, I'll save that one for next one, but it can just bring a lot of awareness to the muscles and to the muscles in your body, and also just the way that your body is working in the posture. I've seen this before too in Warrior Two. So your front foot, you're in kind of a lunge, but your front foot is pointing forwards and your back foot is pointing to the side and your front knee is bent. You place a block between the outside of your leg and the wall, and you have to press out into it. It'll bring awareness to the muscles that are doing that action of your leg pressing out to the side. So you do not have to be, it's kind of a way of like bringing awareness to the muscles in your body without you having to know exactly which muscles are doing what. Like you don't have to be a yoga teacher to do these things and bring awareness. You can just try them out and notice like, oh, okay, cool. Like this is what's happening in this posture, or like, oh, I'm noticing this is harder or this is easier or whatever. Another thing that you can do with props is maybe not a surprise, but you can make the practice harder, which I mean, honestly, doing things from the third point that I made is those are all going to make it harder mostly. Um, they'll make it harder. You might, I mean, if in fitness classes, this is like adding weights. Resistance band is again adding an extra resistance, adding something to it so that your body has to work a little harder. In terms of yoga, this might look like standing on a block safely, please, to make balancing a little bit more challenging. It might look like holding a block in an ab workout, or having a block on your low back when you're doing in a tabletop and you're doing like dead bug, or not dead bugs. I forgot what they're called. We're doing any mobility stuff to make sure your hips aren't moving into it. So that's like, oh, a whole other thing, but basically making sure you go back again, listen to the flexibility episode. And then there's other things that I guess could fit into any of those categories. Like if you have trouble with, like if you're wanting to do something like a full plank, like with your knees lifted, having blocks underneath your hands is going to is like a way of progressing towards having your knees lifted, or using something like a bed or a couch underneath your hands, or using the wall. You could wall as a prop as well. You can do down dog with your hands on the wall, feet on the floor. The other thing that props do is help make movement way more accessible. If you're a person who has disabilities, if you have arthritis, if you're healing from surgeries, injuries, whatever, props are a wonderful way of making the practice actually be a practice that anybody can practice. It's a lot of the word practice in one sentence. There are ways of making the practice meet, like, when people say like meet in the middle, props are the way that you can have the practice come to meet you. Does that make sense? Like, it's the thing that is tied to all this, like the diet culture influence of on yoga and props, is that when we think of yoga, we think of, first of all, we think of a physical practice. We think of a difficult practice. If you Google yoga, it's a very specific body type, thin bodies, often very thin bodies, white women presenting. doing like acrobatic or difficult style or looking postures or shapes. That's not what yoga is. Yoga is not a thing that has to be difficult acrobatic balancing upside down postures. And it also is not a practice solely for thin white bodies. It's a practice that you can do if you are seated in a chair. It's a practice you can do without moving your body at all because yoga is not a physical practice. There is a physical practice of yoga, but that is not what yoga is. Maybe we'll do that in a whole other episode. But I think that that's important to remember is that um, as a whole, it's such a complicated thing, but yoga is not what we've the it's often presented to be. And props are a beautiful way of having our practice be more accessible and more comfortable and more nurturing and more safe and more fun and more restorative and more challenging. They're amazing. So when we're talking about props, there's pretty much endless list, but basics are often blocks and straps. Um, you might also have those wedges. I don't know maybe they're just called a wedge. I'm not sure. Some people use yoga socks. Some people will use, there's many, many other things that might not even be on here. There's the resistance loops, which are not often used in yoga, more so fitness classes. You use a wall, a chair, weights, which you won't usually see in a yoga practice either. So let's talk about alternatives. Alternative for block would be a pillow. Same thing for bolster. Block or bolster alternative would be pillows, couch cushions. If you have like a stuffed animal that you don't mind sitting on or using, um, I have like a little squishmallow thing that I use sometimes for certain postures or certain things. Rolled up towel kind of depends on what you're using it for, like a sweater rolled up. And again, depending on what you're using for, maybe a stack of books. That one, please, I need to put like an asterisk beside it because that is a very tricky one that in some situations might be not safe. Like if you're doing, there's an alternative for a downward dog, like an upside down V shape where you bring both hands onto blocks, which I personally love. If you were to do that with a stack of books, you're probably going to land on your face. So, I mean, use your what is the word? Like your brain, but like your foundational brain. That's not a thing. You know what I mean? Common sense. There we go. Use your common sense, please, and only do things that feel safe. Alternatives for a strap would be like a dog leash, would be a belt, a towel, a piece of rope. It's probably enough alternatives. What else is there? Weights. Alternative to weights would be if you have a kind of depends on how much weight you want because you could just grab like 2 soup cans or 2 things that weigh about the same. You probably want it to be super breakable. If you want something a little bit more like a kettlebell type style or just something a little heavier and you don't have them, you can grab some sort of reusable bag or some sort of bag, probably not a plastic one, put a bunch of soup cans in it or like books in it, or I can't think of things that cans, books, whatever, excuse me, in it so that you can use that as a weight. Alternative to the wedge thing I've mentioned a couple times is just like a face cloth or a towel. If you don't have a mat, you can use a non-slip surface, or which is like most surfaces. I would say not using socks if it's a slippery surface, and then have like a blanket or a towel for if you're doing laying down postures and the ground is kind of hard, it just is a little bit more comfortable to have a little padding. I think that's all of the props that I'm trying to think. I think those are all the ones that would you would need alternatives for. I mean, the socks, you could just use regular socks. But again, if your mat is slippery or if the floor is slippery, it's going to be um, more dangerous. I've mostly seen people use the yoga socks in a setting where it's like a public yoga studio, but I know it's just an individual preference thing. So grippy socks, if you have them, would probably work. Or like if you've ever been to the trampoline park, like those socks might work. Yeah, I think that's everything. I would love to know how you use props. What's your favorite way of using props? Has your impression of props changed since you first started practicing? What do you use as alternatives? I've definitely had people in my practices use like, and I've done it myself when I had a cat, to hold their cat up for for a weight for squats. I had did one where I held Banana, my late cat, passed away last year. I like hugged her and did squats, which is great. I've had some people do that kind of thing with their kids. You can get real creative. You can like go outside, find like a big log, use that as a weight. Um, there's so many ways of. Oh, another thing you can use as a strap too, depending on what you're using it for, is like a broom handle. I've done it before with certain things. It depends on what you need. If you need it to be able to move, it's probably not going to work. Like it's not going to bend in half, but there you go. Another option. I hope this was really helpful. Please send it to everyone you know, or at least everyone you know who practices yoga has or movement has feelings about props or is first starting or needs alternatives for props. You can just give them a little timestamp, tell them what time we started doing this, talking about the alternatives. If you would like to work with me and you want to do this stuff one-on-one, check out the link in the show notes. Find me there. Or if you want to be a guest, if you have questions, if you have feedback, send me an email, info@movewithbillie.com. And I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for listening. Please take a second, subscribe to this, subscribe to this, follow, leave a review. All of those things, they may take like a minute of your time, but they make a massive difference to me as a small business owner, as a small podcast. Would mean the world to me if you could take a second and do those things. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic day. Bye.